It's a weird feeling you get when you turn 27 years old and you realize, dang, I'm now closer to my 30s than my 20s. Such as a moment of existential dread that you don't want to cope with, but that's what I find myself ruminating upon this very day. Yep, I am now 27. Instead of making this occasion out to be some kind of narcissistic vanity project though, I just wanted to try something new for my channel. The idea for that very experiment originated from the following question. What was the most popular movie at the box office on the day I was born? Well, according to Box Office Mojo, that movie happened to be Michael Bay's Bad Boys. I already talked about that movie in my review of the whole trilogy back in 2020 though, so I tossed out that idea. But then I thought, what else was getting people into seats in May 1995? And so it was. I wanted to see what movies were popular that whole entire month, rather than just the specific day I emerged from the womb. Referring back to Box Office Mojo, I found that the following 10 films dominated the American box office throughout that month. To my surprise, I had only seen 3 of these movies prior to the production of this video, so I thought it would be fun to share my thoughts on as many of these movies as I could. Now, for the sake of my time and sanity, I didn't want to talk about every single one of them. Instead, I chose to focus on the movies that have more or less stuck around in pop culture, and were ones that I legitimately wanted to see. I had no particular interest in French Kiss, Forget Paris, and My Family, so they will not be discussed here. I also won't be talking about Casper, because I despise that movie and would rather not waste precious seconds of my now 27-year-long life talking about it. That still left me with 6 other movies to cover though, so I'd say that I have a fair bit of material to work with here. I will briefly touch on each of these 6 films in order of how much I enjoyed them. We'll start with
While You Were Sleeping.
So, we're getting off to a controversial start, aren't we? I'm not going to be surprised if a lot of you who are watching are about to close the tab on your browser, if you haven't already. My goal with this video wasn't to stir the pot with any hot takes. I genuinely wanted to catch up with some movies that are as old as I am. Building off of that, I was open to the various movies that I was either going to watch for the first time, or revisit in a few cases. I'm also totally open to watching chick flicks with my wife, since those kinds of movies have surprised me on occasion. While You Were Sleeping, in particular, always seemed like one of those underrated gems among 90s rom-coms. Imagine my surprise then, when I watched the film and didn't quite have the reaction I was hoping for. To say that my wife, mom, and sister were displeased with my opinion would be the biggest understatement of the entire video. But here's the thing, it takes a special class of romantic comedy to break away from the cliches that plague all of these movies. It's another thing entirely for that same kind of movie to avoid telling a story based solely on a character living a lie. And oh boy, I really don't like it when movies tell these kind of stories. So if the director and writers made this movie specifically knowing that I'd be watching it in April 2022, well, they sort of shot themselves in the foot there. I would say that the film is harmless, and perhaps it is in terms of the tone and humor, but the narrative itself raised some red flags for me as soon as I realized what the movie was trying to do. Simply put, I never felt comfortable with the idea of Sandra Bullock's character perpetuating the lie that she was a comatose man's fiancé, despite the reasons the film gives for her choice to do so. It just felt kind of weird and manipulative to me, especially considering how much creepier it could have been if these characters had been gender swapped. It didn't help the film's case that it tried to use sentimental excuses to make the story more approachable, the likes of which I saw right through. I don't know, if you feel that this is a bad take, I don't blame you. I can have some weird opinions from time to time. You can also take into consideration that romantic comedies are very hit or miss for me. Be that as it may, this was a miss.
Braveheart.
Yeah, now I'm really pissing people off. I'm sure of it. Here we have the Academy Award for Best Picture winner of the movies that came out in 1995. Braveheart also took home the prizes for directing, cinematography, makeup, and sound effects editing, while also being nominated for original screenplay, costume design, film editing, original score, and sound. Granted, the film receiving nominations for many of these things are warranted. Some of the film's sequences have gone on to be iconic for good reason. In particular, the Battle of Stirling is a wonderful sight to see, with its literal battalions of extras clashing in the mud as they help recreate the terrifying realities of medieval warfare. It's a brutal movie from start to finish, and Mel Gibson is a heck of a director for reining in his crew to make the violence this visceral and convincing. That said, in the wake of other epics made since then, historical or otherwise, Braveheart didn't hit anywhere nearly as hard for me on second viewing. I didn't love it on first watch back in 2013, but in watching it again, having other and better movies in mind lessened the impact. A lot of that stems from how the film just feels pretty one-note in its depiction of history. William Wallace is an unequivocal hero that stands in more for the ideal image of conservative American patriotism rather than a legendary Scottish figure. The same can be said about most every other character and how they're depicted in the story, either wholeheartedly representing the side of freedom or violent oppression. History can never be 100% viewed from a black and white lens, and yet that's what the film elects to do, resulting in a story that feels much less authentic than it should. A narrative, whether it's based on true events or not, won't register as well with an audience if they can feel the hand of the writer manipulating the puppet strings. That's how Braveheart felt to me on round number 2. This is also emblematic of how the film has twisted many aspects of historical events to fit into the framework of a Hollywood narrative. I won't pretend to have the definitive knowledge on the subject, since what I do know about how the film deviates from history just stems from the sources compiled on the film's Wikipedia page. Still, the fact that the major discrepancies have been documented and corroborated across multiple sources is at least worth mentioning. The hard part about this is that the film is perfectly watchable, given how professionally it was all put together. I can completely understand why Braveheart has the reputation that it does, for it has the grandeur and scale that one would want from a historical epic such as this. But for me, the context of knowing that this doesn't paint an accurate picture of history, on top of its rather conventional and black and white story, just didn't work for me this time around. Sorry.
Friday.
Don't ever.
Well, I now know what people mean when they say certified hood classic now. I mean, this movie pretty much defines that phrase, doesn't it? I've been familiar with some of the memes that spawned from Friday for quite a while, so I was pleased to finally see them contextualized and made even funnier here. In fact, this very easygoing stoner comedy has plenty of memorable comedic moments peppered throughout. Most of anything that comes out of John Witherspoon's mouth is flat out hysterical, while he also has a couple of moments where his character gets to have a powerful dramatic effect on the story. Chris Tucker was also a welcome sight in what came to be his breakout film role, and deservedly so. I can't really comment on whether his performance was an extension of his stage persona or not, but he was really fun to watch on screen regardless, especially as he played off Ice Cube. In fact, pretty much the whole cast was enjoyable to watch. This is owed to how well the film captured what Ice Cube and his screenwriting partner DJ Pooh intended. According to the two of them, they had grown resentful of how commonly the hood had been depicted as a malevolent, irredeemably violent place that should be feared. They sought to upend these deep-seated notions by drawing upon their own childhood experiences. As a result, their very loose, seemingly improvisational script and the way it was realized by director F. Gary Gray accomplished this very thing. There's a very real sense of community among the various people you see interacting in this laid-back neighborhood, and it's easy to enjoy the kooky misadventures that Craig and Smokey get into. I guess where the film did lose me a bit though is when it started to get serious. Any story should ultimately have a point to it, whatever the moral of said story may be. Friday was bound to have something to say about the culture it showcases front and center. That said, most of the film is comedic and aloof, not really doing well to properly set up the eventual whiplash and tone that occurs roughly 10 to 15 minutes before the credits start rolling. I can't really say that the actual climax itself worked that great for me either, at least for how it was trying to communicate the intended message and character arcs. But in the end, I enjoyed the film and would be happy to watch it again in the future. The third Die Hard has been considered to be the best of the sequels in this pretty uneven franchise, and after this most recent rewatch, I would pretty much agree with that. However, I will say that I think the film is stronger in its first half as opposed to the second. For me, a lot of that hinges on the mystery that keeps on building as Bruce Willis's John McClane and Samuel L. Jackson's Zeus Carver are forced to solve one extremely dangerous clue after another. Tension is released and strung up immediately after the film opens, with a domestic terror bombing established establishing the stakes of what the characters have to deal with. The threat of more bombs continues to be omnipresent as John and Zeus go on a manic race through Manhattan to fulfill the demands of an enigmatic, mysterious voice threatening violence over a telephone. The first half of the movie is so fun because of how much these scenarios set the stakes for the adventure, but also for how the action sequences themselves play out. John McTiernan, who returned to direct after having made the first film, succeeded at making a lot of these sequences comical without sacrificing the tension. In particular, the car chase in which John and Zeus race across traffic in Central Park is equal parts nail-biting and hysterical, as the comedic chemistry between Willis and Jackson reaches its peak with the insanity that ensues. Still, like I was alluding to earlier, the second half doesn't work for me as well, since the reveal of Simon Gruber's actual villainous intent lessens some of the suspense of what came before. Knowing that he's less interested in randomly killing people and more invested in stealing gold to inflict economic ruin just doesn't quite hit the same. For a film with the word vengeance in its title, retribution isn't exactly an emotional catalyst for the events of the movie. I would also say that the film doesn't really have much to do with John McClane in terms of furthering his character arc, although it is very entertaining to see how much the movie tests his limits as a hero. He doesn't have a lot to lose in his personal life, but deeply cares about protecting people nonetheless, which enables him to do some truly outlandish stuff in the name of saving the citizens of New York. All in all, it's an action movie that I quite enjoyed from beginning to end, and rewatching it reminded me that it deserves a spot in my Blu-ray collection. Out of all 6 of these movies, a Goofy movie is the one I'm most nostalgic for. After all, it's the only one of these that I grew up with, similarly to a lot of my peers who were kids during the blockbuster era. This didn't do all that well in theaters, but like many movies that came out back then, its release on VHS breathed new life into its public reputation. Nowadays, it's considered a cult classic that lots of millennials genuinely enjoy well into their adult lives. Count me among that same group. Now the thing about that is when I talked about While You Were Sleeping, I criticized that film for basing its whole story about a character perpetuating a lie. I also generally don't care about road trip movies. A Goofy movie happens to be a hybrid of both. So why does it work so well for me? Well, a simple answer to that question is that the film is just so fun that it kind of transcends the trappings of either type of story. Goofy's desire to go on a road trip isn't motivated by some dumb excuse the writers made up, but rather because Goofy feels it's in the best interest of his son. In contrast, Max's teenage emotions and chances for winning over his crush Roxanne feel threatened by his sudden realization of the cross-country trip he essentially feels forced into taking. Therefore, even though his lie about going to the Powerline concert in LA is sort of cringe in the moment, it makes sense why he would be compelled to dig himself into a ditch like that. There's a good conflict that emerges between Goofy and Max due to their mismatched priorities, and it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of what either person wants. What happens from there are plenty of legitimately funny antics that occur as they travel across the country, while also encountering Pete and his son PJ along the way. I don't know, the cynical part of me is trying to tell me not to like this as much, but I've always really enjoyed it. In fact, I've only come to appreciate it more with age for its witty humor, and how the simplicity of the story really works in its favor. A Goofy movie is really short, clocking in at just 78 minutes, even with credits. The result is a movie which doesn't unnecessarily drag itself out with filler. It's a lean experience which breezes by with comedic sequences that have since become iconic, particularly when Goofy and Max crash the Powerline concert. Speaking of which, the music is also really good for the most part. There's a reason why a bunch of people who went to my same high school made a popular live-action parody of After Today on this very website. This film just made an impression upon people close to my age, and I'm glad that it continues to make younger generations smile as well. I just really enjoyed it. Need I say more? And here we arrive at my favorite of these movies. I didn't expect to have this be my opinion, but am I disappointed? Not at all, for this was an absolutely thrilling experience. You may or may not have heard of what a contained thriller is. It's a tense narrative set within one or very few locations. Well, you can't get more contained with your story than by setting it in a submarine. Crimson Tide basically has the perfect setup, since the American sailors stuck together aboard the USS Alabama are faced with the very real possibility of being ordered to launch nuclear warheads against Russian ultranationalists. What makes matters worse is that at one point, the ship's communication systems get damaged. The crew then receives an incomplete message as to whether they have authorization to fire their missiles or not. What ensues is possibly the most butt-clenchingly suspenseful morality play you could ever see, and I loved every second of it. After all, the fact that it is set almost entirely aboard this submarine is a major reason why the story works so well. If the filmmakers inserted scenes of the crazy Russians and American diplomats trying to reach peace negotiations, that could diffuse some of the natural tension of the situation. They probably could have made the story work nonetheless, but there's something uniquely tense about watching this unfold exclusively from the perspective of the submarine crew. All of the sailors may belong to the same side, but it's incredibly compelling to watch their relationships deteriorate as differences in ideology, opinion, and interpretation of military protocol drive wedges between them. In particular, the characters portrayed wonderfully by Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman. All of the performers do a great job emphasizing the sweat-inducing pressure of the situation, though, both by the actual sweat on their faces, but also successfully depicting the ever-growing desperation of their actions aboard the ship. All of this is complemented by how well made the film is. Obviously, a submarine is already a claustrophobic setting, but as the film goes on and the situation continues to get more dire, the late director Tony Scott utilized more near close-up shots and Dutch angles to visually heighten the intensity of what was going on. In other movies, these kinds of shots could be used as annoying visual distractions, but here, the implementation thereof is an accurate way of showing just how serious the crew's plight is. This is very much so a show-not-tell movie in terms of depicting the characters' emotions. Their dialogue mainly consists of bickering over how to fulfill their duties on the ship, whereas their thoughts and feelings are more successfully communicated by how the camera frames the actors on set. It also doesn't hurt that Hans Zimmer composed an excellent score as he usually does, and the second half of the movie is edited so that it feels like what's happening takes place in real time. In the future, when someone asks me what a good example of a single location thriller is, I will make sure to tell them to watch Crimson Tide. And that's it! Thank you for letting me take the time to talk about some movies that have been around for as long as I have been. If you liked what you saw and would be interested in seeing more of what I have to offer, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining the notification squadron so that you don't miss out on my future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great one.